perhaps we should start. All right, I'm going to kick it off because it is 3:30. Having this session live captioned or closed captioned. You can turn them on by clicking the closed captions button in the top menu of the Zoom screen. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands from which we are connecting online today and their ongoing connection to land, waters and culture. Our panellists are coming to you from Wadawurrung and Wurundjeri country, so I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present and future of these lands, as well as to all First Nations people with us in the session today. My name is Artie and I am the Training and Development Manager at The Push. The Push is a statewide youth music organisation in its 32nd year of incorporation. We deliver a range of programs, including professional development programs and presentations, concerts, gigs that are relevant and responsive to Victoria's future music industry leaders and audiences. You can stay connected with us if you would like. We're on most social media at the handle The Push Inc., which is all one word. As we go through this session, I encourage you to post any questions you may have into the Q&A tab and feel free to chat to other participants in the chat tab as well. I will be available to chat to through the session because today in partnership with VCA, we are in conversation to explore how emerging independent artists, curators and event promoters can create events and spaces, both online and off, which are accessible, safe and welcoming for all. From both a cultural and a practical point of view as well. And I think we have a really great panel who can help us to begin to explore some of the perspectives and approaches around this. We're very lucky to have Kristie Walker facilitating this panel today. Kristie has been devoted to creating accessible, safe and welcoming experiences in her own practice, working closely with the Meredith Music Festival and Golden Plains Festival team, as well as theatrical productions like Donna Jackson's We Built This City and Yanagai Yanagai by Andrea James, through to civic and community activities like the Black Saturday Bushfire Recovery workshops and anniversary events. So I am going to hand over to her to explore today's topic with our wonderful panel.
Thanks very much, Artie. Yes, it's an absolute indulgence for me to spend time together exploring this. And thankfully, our know-how in this area is evolving at a much more rapid rate than it did when I started out. And while that's wonderful, there is still a need for us all to get better and better at it. So sharing ideas with each other like we're doing today contributes enormously to that progress. In earlier green room conversations with our panel, we discussed that our sector is very well placed to lead progress in this area, to achieve access for all, feeling and being welcome, and feeling and being safe. And we discussed that on an individual level, we can each do our part to identify barriers to help satisfy really what are fundamental and universal human needs, regardless of our role and our specific work orientation. We discussed that as a sector, we already bring diverse people together to give many a common ground, and that across the creative industries, we are in the practice of reimagining the impossible to make things possible. Each panelist shared some of the things that they're wondering about, like how can we create spaces where we amplify the voices of people that are not often heard, where there are no barriers to entry, where every person, regardless of age, background, or circumstance, feels accepted, appreciated, and catered to the same way every other person does, where every person can step into a space where they feel safe and welcome to stay. How can different voices, perspectives, and lived experience be visible and celebrated? How can we give young people the opportunity to experience contemporary arts and culture and extend their knowledge and networks? How can we unpack structural and systemic exclusivity? I am very grateful we have an incredibly resourceful panel who will help explore these questions and more with us today. So to them. Joining us on the panel is festival aficionado and general gig fiend Dina Bassel, who founded Tibby, a consultancy and training business dedicated to challenging the landscape of live music, events, and venues to be more accessible to the disabled community. At the core of Tibi is a spirit of inclusivity and a will to open up gigs and events of all sizes to everyone. Dina has worked on events from Big Sound Festival to Midsummer Festival and everything in between. Welcome to you, Dina.
Thank you very much.
Young music industry professional Molly Jessup also joins us. Molly has experience creating pathways for youth to enter the industry and has worked on major projects for Arts Centre Melbourne, including White Night Reimagined and the Future Ecos Festival. Molly is currently the leading workshop facilitator at the Push's New Slang Committee, which is currently overseeing Stereo Live project for Parliament Victoria, which is responding to youth isolation through the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome to you, Molly.
Thanks very much.
Proud Kaditch woman Rona Glenn McDonald is here. Rona works with high impact organisations to propel social change. Rona has a background in economics and a deep curiosity and passion for disruptive ideas. Rona is currently the director of First Nations at YLab, a social enterprise that puts young people with diverse lived experiences at the centre of designing and developing innovative and impactful solutions to complex social issues. Rona is also the founder of Common Ground, a not-for-profit that shares Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, histories, and lived experiences. We welcome you, Rona.
Thanks for having me.
And Sally Mesa joins us. With over 16 years experience in music venues, Sally has worked in a variety of roles, including booking, marketing, ticketing, logistics, and hospitality. In Sally's previous role with the Corner Group, Sally had the opportunity to help develop a number of initiatives focused on encouraging safe, diverse, and accessible spaces. Sally is now looking forward to continuing this as the Programming and Commercial Manager at the Forum Melbourne. Welcome to you, Sally.
Thanks, Kristie.
And Tariro Mamvando is here. Tariro, who also goes by Hope, is a Zimbabwean-born multidisciplinary artist raised in Narm, Melbourne, whose body and breadth of work spans across multiple disciplines: acting, performance poetry, spoken word, writing, movement, directing, consultation, and facilitation. Tariro is the co-CEO and co-artistic director of Western Edge Youth Arts, also known as WEA. WEA is a 20-year-old youth performing arts company that works across Melbourne's western suburbs, providing space for young people to come together to tell their own stories in their own way and with their own voice. By providing a safe space to explore creativity, learn new artistic practices, and develop leadership skills, WEA constructs supportive pathways for young people to achieve their own creative agency. Welcome to you, Tiara.
Thank you for having me. Hi, everyone.
And thank you all for being here. And Tiara, I'd actually like to start with you because I understand some of these themes have influenced your decision to accept your new role with Western Edge Youth Arts. I'm wondering what you can share about your observations and experiences that led you to accepting the co-CEO and co-artistic role at WEA.
Yeah, big question. So I grew up in Frankston, and I actually, me and my family arrived when I was 5 years old, and I developed like selective mutism, just from the trauma of having to resettle in somewhere that was completely different to what I was used to. And I found for me, theatre was a space where I felt actually the most comfortable when I was growing up. And then I was like, I really want a career in the art. I just grew to love it. And I was like, I really want a career in the arts. And so eventually I trained at the VCA. And when I graduated, I just found so many barriers. And I was really struggling in terms of representation and visibility of different cultural experiences on main stage, particularly. And so since then, I've worked probably on most main stage theatre, theatre production, not productions, theatre stages. And I realized a lot of people are doing it right in terms of there's definitely an increase in visibility and representation, but not so much on leadership roles, and not so much when you kind of break it down structurally. Who's operating day to day in these places? who are in the leadership roles. And I feel like there's still a lot of work to unpack in terms of large scale companies. And so when this opportunity arose, I saw artistic director. It wasn't actually co-artistic director, it was artistic director at Waya open up. And I was like, oh, I feel actually this is where I can make huge impact in my life right now. In a leadership role, and totally restructuring a company and making it a lot more inclusive. And I feel like this is a space where we can fail. I don't think women, particularly, especially, and women of colour, don't really have permission in terms of large companies to fail in a similar way than I'd say cis het white male men do. And so this is actually a really great opportunity to, I think, to kind of implement things that I've seen in career-wise that I think just because of red tape and bureaucracy, it's hard. It just takes a while. And I feel like somewhere like Waya gives me permission and allows me to be able to implement things a lot quicker and faster, and potentially be kind of like an example to the industry going, yeah, it is possible to become inclusive and accessible and welcoming, and that be the ethos and the spirit, really. And so that was my decision.
What a wonderful example. Thank you. And Rona, I'd like to bring you in. You've talked about the importance of co-designing and co-delivering programs and events so that there is lived experience embedded into making spaces accessible. What's been your experience of embedding lived experience into the work, into the practice?
Yeah, great question. I think echoing what Doriro said around visibility, in order to create visibility, it's not just about representation, it's about structures and systems as well. And actually to shift those structures and systems, we need to embed people with lived experience into spaces in which they can design. When I talk about this, I'm bringing my experience from YLab, a social enterprise that trains and employs young people to solve complex social problems. So we put young people at the centre of driving solutions to the world's problems. And I think that when we think about the arts and music spaces and creating welcoming and accessible spaces, I think Melbourne in particular, and I'm assuming that a lot of people signing in today and listening in are probably in the context of Melbourne and Victoria, definitely is at the forefront of a lot of the shifts that we need to see in order to be safer and welcoming and more accessible for all. But there's always more we can do. And I think that when you really look at embedding lived experience, not only, to sense check, but actually to design and deliver an engagement, that's when you really see the transformative shifts that we need to be seeing. And while I think that, we are on the cusp of change, there's always more that can be done in that design. So I'm thinking of like experiences, I'm new to the music industry, right? I'm an aspiring producer and I work within a professional context outside of the music industry. But as a young person, as a Kaditch woman from Central Australia in Melbourne, I've seen even in the last 6 years, some huge shifts in the way that the music industry will create and, deliver events, and it's awesome. But I also think that for us to continue to be pushing the needle and making, more significant changes, we need to be bringing in young people, in all people with, different backgrounds, different lived experiences, different age groups to be at the centre of creating those spaces. Because unless we have them designing and delivering them, then, those spaces aren't going to be, they won't be safe and they won't be accessible for all. So I think that when, I talk about embedding lived experience, there's different ways you can do that. You have to pay people for their time. That's like the number one thing. But you can put people into the roles, into that seat, and really see structural shifts in the way that you're listening to their voices and amplifying their voices in ways that make change.
And Molly, let's bring you in because you've expressed concern as a young industry professional about the concept of underestimation for young people in the industry. What is the experience of this for young people, and what kinds of things are affecting the experience for youth in the creative industries?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'm really lucky to work in an organisation that values my input as a young person. But I know often working in other projects, particularly in the arts and music sector, a lot of the time organisations tend to realise there's been a bit of a shift in the last couple of years where organisations have realised that they do need a youth perspective on their events, but often only realise that they need that input rather than actually taking on board people's opinions. I think, yeah, often young people are just underestimated as people that don't have a lot of experience in the sector or don't know what they want. And I think it's so relevant, particularly in this day and age when planning events for young people, to just always ensure that young people's feedback is taken on board, and yeah, just really keeping them involved every step of the way of a project. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm wondering, are there good examples, good local examples that you can point to, Molly, projects or organisations, I guess, who are modelling inclusion for young people?
Absolutely. I mean, I guess, coming from my own organisation, the Push does a really great job in always including people as as an organisation that really values youth. And I know we've got a lot of projects that really cover a wide range of music and arts and culture. And I think as well, taking on board people's feedback really comes into play at the Push. There are a few other organisations, like Freezer, for example, is really good in a regional and metropolitan sense. And yeah.
Yeah, terrific. And Sally, I'd like to bring you in because one of the most powerful mental shifts you've had, as I understand, working in this area is the use of the term barriers to access. And I'm wondering what you can tell us about that and what you noticed became possible for you when you made this mental shift in language.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the term I discovered the term through some training from Arts Access Victoria, which was, I guess, operating based on in the accessibility space. But we found in working on the projects, using the term barrier to access rather than terms like disability or accessibility, it really changed our view of what that means and what that meant towards how we could change things. So rather than looking at it as an individual's problem or, something that we couldn't achieve, it basically meant that we could look at what we were doing and what we could do to take steps to improve both accessibility, but also just, things like safer spaces and gender equity and things like that.
Yeah, and you are a particular fan of Listen.org's motto, you can't be what you can't see. Can you share with us how that's resonated for you?
Well, I think it goes back to what both Tariro and Rona were saying in terms of people being in certain positions and in spaces. If you particularly for young people or people that are looking to grow their careers, it's hard to have something to aspire to if you can't see people as good examples there. And it also in itself creates a barrier to access in that it doesn't seem achievable if there's no one doing it before you. And there's some very strong and courageous people that can create their own pathways, but it's really important for anyone looking to program or employ people to think about who they're employing and what that looks from a public perspective, as well as valuing those people in their organisations.
And Dina, you have an exceptional example of this. I'd like to bring you in because your business, Tivi, worked on U2's Joshua Tree Tour in 2019. What was your approach to make this big event accessible? And can you give us a taste of the kind of feedback you received and how it even came about?
It was a very big show that we were working on. Obviously, U2 are a very big band and have a variety of ages and genders and types of people that are fans of U2. So when we approached to create a more accessible environment, I came from a point of reaching out to the people that are coming to the show, because what you need to remember in terms of accessibility and disability is that no two people are the same. No one person's needs are going to be exactly the same as the next person's needs. So we put out a list of communications and sent it out to people who had access barriers. And they were directly able to contact me and to know that someone was on their side, and there to make sure that they had a good time, and then they were going to be looked after, was something that I think people really appreciated. The feedback was, it was incredible. Just the simple thing of me saying, here's my number, here's my email, I'm on site, if you need anything, please call me. People were beyond grateful to have that, because they knew that they were safe, they knew they were looked after. And I think one of the biggest, what's the word? I guess the biggest barrier for people with disabilities and going out is the lack of access, and then the nerves that come with going out, and knowing that they had someone there to sort of back them was really great. Yeah.
And what are you learning from artists and curators and promoters about what they feel is in their way to achieve accessible, safe and welcoming experiences?
I think the biggest thing is when people hear accessibility, they think they need to completely change their venue or their festival or their space, and they're worried about budgets, when it starts with what you have on your website, what information you can give out, being there for people, which, you know, most times cost nothing. It's that initial anxiety that people, you know, are struggling to see past, and the lack of knowledge as well, which is why I started TB, to sort of give industry professionals the knowledge that they need to know that they can be an accessible space, be an accessible venue, without, you know, the big stress and burden of a budget.
Yeah, and Sally, I'd like to bring you in. And just before I do, this is a great time for our live participants to start sharing questions in the Q&A tab about anything the panel has been exploring so far, or something else that you might be interested in their perspective on. And we'll get to some of your questions soon. But to continue to explore these tips and practical steps we can take, Sally, what was it about exploring communication that was so important to the success of Safer Spaces projects that you worked on in your role with the Corner Group?
Yeah, sure. We had, I think there was probably two parts to that, as I kind of mentioned, but there's the internal communications was really important for particularly the work that we were doing in Safer Spaces, and diversity training as well, which just meant that, you know, no matter what we were doing, that the staff were the first ones to know what the principles of the business were, but also what our expectations on them were, so that then when you are taking that to the public, that, you know, everyone was on the same page and knew exactly where you were coming from, and to make sure that people truly understood what we were trying to do. But also in terms of the external stuff, we spent a lot of time developing our accessibility pages on our website, which, you know, included things like photos and just general information on how to get there, and a lot of really detailed information for people, not I guess making the assumption that accessibility only means someone with a physical disability or someone in a wheelchair, which we kind of knew that it would have a positive effect, but out of all of the stuff that I've worked on, it probably was the most impactful, and we got the most feedback on, just because it took away people's anxiety coming in. They knew exactly what to expect and exactly who to contact and who they could speak to, and it allowed people to ask questions and feel like they could ask for help or ask for extra service without being judged. So it was hugely impactful across all of the parts of our organisation.
And what sort of feedback did you receive, Sally? Were there any particular sort of standout feedback that you received about those programs and that approach?
Yeah,
having that information available.
I think in the first month of having the accessibility page up on the Corner Hotel website, we got about, I think, 7 or 8 emails from patrons that, you know, had been coming on and off for a while, but they had always been a bit kind of wary, or not even knowing that they could ask for help for certain things, or certain things were available to them, and just basically expressing that they were so grateful and just made, you know, felt so much more comfortable that they could come to the venue and not need to, you know, worry about it, and not have to feel like they needed support in being able to do that. So it was huge. I think it was a very emotional time when we first did that, because just realizing what a little thing, like, you know, a few hours work and no money can make such a huge difference to someone's life and someone's ability to access, you know, our venue. It was huge.
And Tariro, you've can you describe, I guess, for everyone's benefit, what happens when someone turns up at Western Edge Youth Arts, and what's the check-in process, and what are you noticing about the experience for participants when they turn up to the venue, to the space?
Yeah, I guess Western Edge is a bit unique in the way that majority of who comes into our rooms are POC young people, and so already that's different. And so we have an open access policy. Everything's free for young people. Anyone can come. And we work with who's in the room always. And so what we've been starting to implement is in our check-ins, we always have check-ins. And before COVID happened, when we were meeting in the same physical space, we would always provide food, which was an equalizer, because, you know, there's a lot of, there's a diversity of different people who come into the room, just ensure that people are fed. And yeah, something we've been implementing is pronouns and positionality. And the idea of positionality, which a lot of people, I haven't come across a lot of people who kind of speak to positionality, and that's when you kind of name the elephants in the room from your perspective. How do you see where you are positioned in society, on a class level, on a race level, on an able level, on all the levels? And so in check-ins, you sort of acknowledge your privileges and your underprivileges as well, so that the elephants in the room have been named, and we're kind of starting from that space of, like, I guess, transparency, honesty, and also it's a really great way to just show how kind of multifaceted we all are. Because even though I'm a Black woman, which I guess ordinarily that would look like our underprivilege, but actually that is also a privilege, because I do have, you know, access to a culture that has existed for a long time. So on a level that is both an underprivilege and a privilege, I'm also middle class, educated, and so that is a privilege. And so when people start to articulate it from themselves, you can see in the room there's all these levels that we're always coexisting in, and so it just allows us to go quite deep early with who comes into our rooms.
And there's incredible rigor involved, as I understand, and this ability to maintain failing and learning quickly. And I wonder if you can share with us, you know, how you've achieved that.
Well, young people are awesome. So I think, you know, I don't see it as a lot of work. I think the young people who we work with are already, I feel like there's, I think young people already have this beautiful state of becoming, are at a state where they are constantly becoming themselves, growing into themselves. And so that's an awesome place to start. And yeah, there was one thing I wanted to say before the fail while standing. Can you repeat the question?
The rigor. I'm so impressed with the rigor, and I wonder what's involved in that. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually think for people to really do accessibility and inclusivity right, it does take a level of rigor. It does take a level of effort, which shouldn't deter people. But I think there's something about sitting in spaces of discomfort that we need to, in order for us to get to the other place of harmony and equality and peace. I think we really need to all sit in our discomforts. And so I guess that permission in our rooms allows this idea of failing and being messy and and making mistakes to kind of go, yeah, we're going to do that anyway. We're humans. We always make mistakes, and it's actually okay as long as we can always come back to our center and unpack it and come to a kind of some kind of safe space together. I think it's fine. I don't know how we could have conversations about disability or sexuality or gender or race without making mistakes, without it being messy. I think those things inherently are. And so I guess that's where we come from, that premise.
And Rona, can you describe how you've successfully embedded lived experience into the design and delivery of programs and events, and what it looks like, what tips you might have from your experience of embedding the lived experience?
Something that Tariro just said is like, I can't leave it behind. I just want to emphasize it around how uncomfortable it can be. And actually, we've got to get used to sitting in that discomfort, like sitting there and being like, okay, all right, if I'm working in this space, I'm going to be uncomfortable for the next 60 years because there's always, it's always a new bespoke space that you're creating or an event you're creating. And I think that's a really important frame to bring in. And like my experience, when we embed lived experience and when we co-design with young people, we have 90 associates from across Australia who all have a deep lived experience with something. They all bring themselves, themselves being incredibly unique to the work that they're doing. We train them and we pay them to facilitate, to design, to build solutions. And the payment's a really important piece because it's about creating a power dynamic where people are paid for their expertise. You have to pay people for that. As a black fellow in Australia, I constantly get DMs blowing up all the time, people asking me about, what I think of X, Y, or Z, which is emotional labor in itself. And I think people are becoming more understanding of, the toll it takes on individuals to constantly be that person that's asked for their response. But when you pay someone for their response and, pay them to do a co-design workshop or pay them for their expertise, you're valuing that lived experience and saying that it has inherent value in the work that you're doing. So I think that's a really key thing, is we always pay people. And in the events, the events music space, thinking about when we think about inclusion for First Nations people and voices, it's more than just a welcome to country or saying that sovereignty is never ceded. What if we all started an event or started, if we were designing a festival and we sat down with the traditional owners on the land that it was on and said, what do you want out of this? I'm bringing my potential company, resources, music, all of this, incredible stuff that a traditional owner often wouldn't, have access to that kind of resourcing. And you sit down with them and you go like, what do you want out of this? And let's have a conversation, and I'll pay you to advise me on what I can do more in this space to create something that is truly transformative and isn't just, something that's quite tokenistic and inbuilt just into our normalized systems. So I think that, something that I think about is, one, paying people always. And I keep hammering that home in this panel. So you all leave this panel with that really important point. But the other thing is thinking about how every space is new. And just because you've done an event before doesn't mean the next event should be a replication or a duplicate of that. And I think that creating, a mindset where we're always going into these new spaces and designing things from the bottom up is really powerful. And it means that, the spaces we're creating will continue to push the dial on what is possible in terms of accessibility and inclusivity and creating spaces that are welcoming for all.
And Rona, what kind of feedback have you been receiving from artists and curators and promoters with that approach?
I think that it's hard, right? If someone was asking, how do I do this better? And you tell them the truth, you have to find more money and you have to find more time. The response is that it's hard, but when you come out of an event and you've created an event or something that is completely new and unique, every person that came to that event or that space is going to remember it forever. So I think that when you see the impact of that, people are always incredibly stoked, and there's a lot of value in that. So they might see the time and money they put in, but the impact goes so much further than that.
And Molly, I'd like to bring you back in here in terms of how we can facilitate young voices and I guess what successful approaches you're aware of from that consultation through that feedback stage. And that, I guess, that notion of if we're going to remain open and flexible to all kinds of feedback, how have you and others successfully looked after people receiving that critical feedback?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to touch on something that Rona said before about kind of being imaginative and being creative about events and spaces that you make. And I think that's such an important thing with young people. Often venues or event producers will see the idea of a music event must be in a pub or must be in a place that serves liquor, and often it's that whole de-licensing and the really complications of that, and people just go, it's too hard, let's just not do it, or it becomes quite costly. But often, I mean, when I was growing up, some of the best events that I went to were in spaces that wouldn't be considered I guess music or live event spaces. Often, like I went to one at the Treasury Gardens, and it was amazing. It was just this amazing like gig in the park, and yeah, so just being really flexible and thinking outside the box of where and how you can present an event to young people, just to kind of get out of that whole traditional sense of like the gigs in pubs type thing is really important. Touching on the feedback type of question, I guess feedback, particularly for young people are so absorbed in a lot of different things. It's very hard, I think, for most people to have an attention span for more than one thing when we have so many different sources of information coming to us. And I think it's just so important just to remember that feedback doesn't have to always be a very formal thing. It can be quite an informal thing. Just like I know whenever I'm facilitating workshops or running events, I always just do a little like quick SurveyMonkey link at the end, and you know, you won't get everyone responding to that obviously, but just the few that do, often they'll really put in the time and just be like, hey, I'd like to see this, or you know, I'd like to see like this band play. Like it can be really important just to get like an outsider's perspective. Like I know even, you know, I'm guilty of this as well, of just getting feedback from the people in the Pushes kind of inner circle of young people that have been involved. But often it's really valuable to get a really broad sense from a large range of sources of young people, and just people in general can be really important. Sorry, I know I'm talking a lot, but the other thing I just wanted to touch on is young people being really ever evolving. And I know myself, like I was, you know, a young person 3 or 4 years, I mean, I am still a young person, but a teenager like 3 or 4 years ago. And it's just so interesting, particularly with the ways that we communicate has just really changed. I know that's a really important tip, is to just constantly be checking in with young people to see how they communicate and how they engage with each other, particularly in a virtual sense. When I was starting my new slang program this year, I just usually what we do is we put them all in a Facebook group together, and that's how we do our online communication. But then I was told by probably 3/4 of the group that, oh, we don't use Facebook anymore, we just use Instagram. And yeah, it's really important to just keep checking in on people and just seeing how they communicate, because it's easy, even as a young person myself, I feel like an old person now. So yeah, really important just to touch base with people.
And Dina, I'd like to bring you in because to one of Molly's points, you also mentioned this importance of creativity in how to reach people of all abilities. And I'm wondering, can you share with us how this is achieved? I know you've got an extraordinary example of Melbourne Fashion Festival last year. But what are the sorts of ideas and approaches you've been using to help?
I always say this to industry professionals when they come to me and ask for advice. I say, you work in the creative industries. It's all within the name of being creative in what you can produce. So the example that I had told you, Kristie, was Melbourne's Fashion Festival teamed up with Kangan University last year to create a fashion line with tactile and sensory elements. So through creating this fashion show, people with vision impairments could enjoy a fashion show that they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise, through the touching and feeling different objects in different patterns. And other examples are within theatre. Some productions will do what you call a relaxed performance, and if anyone is interested in theatre, I do suggest that you go onto YouTube and look into it, because it is incredible what is done. And again, it's easy, and it's not overly expensive, and you are reaching a big group of people who are otherwise ignored and forgotten about.
And so when you're, I guess, beginning to work with an artist or a creator or a promoter, what are the kind of key steps that you recommend they consider when they're starting a new project? And I guess a secondary question to that is, at what phase it's really helpful to have someone like you with specific expertise in an area to be brought in on a project?
I guess the earlier the better, because then you are able to plan for what you need to do, and I work with you to ensure that I'm meeting your budget and what works best for you, for your event or your production or your whatever it is that you're releasing. Sorry, can you repeat the question? It was a very long question.
Yes, yeah. I just wondered what I guess the key tips for for an artist or a curator or a promoter who's just starting out on a project. What are those sort of first steps that you'd be recommending that they look at to take and consider?
Yeah, I guess it depends on the project, but I always start with what's on your website, what can we improve with what information that you're giving out. That's always the crucial thing that I push for, is that what you've got available for the public, and then to also have a person of contact, where, as I've previously mentioned, every person's needs are different. So whatever you might have online may not answer the question that they have. Some questions that I have received are, can I bring my medications into a venue? And venues might have, you can't bring this water bottle, or you cannot bring umbrellas, but they have nothing about medication. So it's primarily about the information that you give is what I start with. And then I guess it depends on the event, and we can go into specifics about what we can do to create an accessible space or venue or whatever it is that we're doing.
So wonderful. I'm wondering whether or not there's anything in particular, while we invite the live participants to share any questions they may have for you. I wonder whether or not there's anything that's shown up for any of you in the conversation that you'd like to elaborate further on.
I just wanted to say to the point before about doing a lot of this work is bound to make you uncomfortable, or expected to make you uncomfortable. I think as well, at a lot of the stages of this, you need to expect some negative feedback as well, and be okay with that, and use that as a point of learning rather than a stopping point. In opening yourself up by doing this stuff, you are also opening up to higher expectations, which is a great thing. Don't see it as a negative thing, see it as I guess a stepping stone. We definitely have felt that a lot along the way, but every time it's just using it as part of the pathway, not the end point, I guess.
And Sally, how have you I guess experienced creating a culture that can sustainably manage that sort of critical feedback?
I guess, again, it just goes back to communication and making sure that, because the staff are generally the ones that are going to be getting that feedback. It's never going to come straight to the person that's, I guess, trying to implement the programs. But in that, you just need to give them the confidence to take it on, and for everyone to know that it's a learning process, and to know that everyone's willing to keep on pushing forward. I think that's always been the thing. Staff training and communication is so important in these things, because otherwise, that you can just take on negative feedback and not want to push forward, or just feel like we're doing the wrong thing, when in fact it's actually showing that you're doing the right thing and people are just having higher expectations of you.
And you had an experience where you underwent an accessibility audit, Sally, with Arts Access Victoria. Can you share your experience of that audit and I guess the results, the outcomes?
Yeah, that was actually really, really great. We got some mystery shoppers into our venues. So it happened over a 2-month period, and there was, I think, 4 in total with different barriers, I guess, to access different types of physical or, there was one person that had brain injury, so different experiences coming into the venue. And basically they came in and sort of ordered food and gave us feedback on how the experience was and what they found difficult and what we could improve on. And I think that in itself was super helpful to realize, one, what we hadn't even thought about as a problem, but also the things that we had been doing right and what we could push further, which that biggest flag for that was that it definitely isn't just about putting ramps in everywhere, because we had done things like that, but even things like signage or having security staff trained to direct certain ways, or doorways and how doors open and things like that, it was massive for us.
Sarah, I can see you nodding. I'm wondering if you have a thought there to share.
Oh, I'm just loving everything everyone's saying. I'm just like, oh yeah. That's just my normal like vibing. I did want to say something in terms of having conversations around positionalities and cross-cultural relating. So me and Penny Harpham, who's the other co-CEO and artistic director of Western Edge, often we've had so many, the relationship, we didn't know each other before we both came into the role, and actually we sort of fought for the role for co, which was already kind of dismantling or shaking up the structure at WAYA. And so we run cross-cultural like diversity and inclusion workshops, and quite often the room is quiet when we talk, and often after the sessions a lot of people will come one-to-one and then they'll go, I'm quiet because I am feeling so much white guilt. I'm really struggling with this information and sitting in discomfort because I'm not used to it. And so I guess I say that, and then also they say they found the workshop profoundly informative, educational, and impactful. So I think for me, especially with like George Floyd and Black Lives Matter and First Nations movements here, I feel like I guess I don't want to deter people from having those conversations. I feel like there's elephants in the room in this country that's not named. Often we talk about minority groups as the ones with the trauma, but I think there's also trauma that comes from being white, and we often don't talk about that. We don't talk about white guilt. We don't talk about, and I think there's a difference between guilt and shame. And guilt is something I think is a process to work through. I think shame is you're a good person. You know that there's a lot of things, there's a lot of sorry business in this country that needs to be addressed, and you feel bad about what's happened. I think that's, you're a good person if you're feeling shame. In terms of guilt, I think that's another thing that I think there needs to be more spaces actually for people to be able to unpack that in a safe way together. So I guess this big rant of mine, I guess what I'm saying is, please don't be deterred by the discomfort of it, because I think the benefits of actually going deep and in this work is actually much more fruitful than the negative aspects of it.
And what are you finding at the moment in terms of avenues with the inability to be in person during COVID and the rise of, are you finding any online or virtual format that is working for those sort of conversations and that sort of work?
It's been a heavy year for people of color, I think, especially for our young artists. Like, it's this compounding trauma. We lost one of our young people as well. They were killed in Brimbank. You might have heard about the story in the media, but yeah, so it's been a really a lot of youth suicides happening in communities, so there's quite a lot. So yes, I kind of echo what everyone's saying in terms of we've had to bring in specialists who kind of teach or train in trauma-informed settings, as well as like bring in therapists in the online space as well. Our check-ins have been extra long, because there's been a lot of unpacking and a lot of expressing, quite intense emotions and feelings.
And Rona, what about you from your perspective, the rise of virtual events? Do you think that's made it easier or more difficult in terms of accessibility? Oh, we've got you now.
I've been thinking about this a lot, actually. From like my personal perspective, the events that I see go online, like when we think about access online, I think that we're seeing inequalities that are magnified in this moment. So people that, can't go to school because of COVID, now they're stuck at home, there's no internet at home. How are you going to access an Instagram Live? How are you going to access, these amazing events are being put online, but they're not necessarily accessible to the people that really want to be accessing them. So I think that we've seen in this moment, the magnification of many inequalities that already existed. And because of that, I hope that, governments and institutions will work to address that, because if you can't access things online, then, what was the point in the NBN? I think that, I've definitely seen that, particularly in the spaces that I work in with young First Nations people. But also there's been this really interesting thing that's happened with online events, and in particular workshops and spaces online that you create, where people who might not feel comfortable speaking up or being a part of, a physical space can now access it, watch it, and leave a comment or write something down when they wouldn't, necessarily be able to speak up about it. So I think that there's been some really interesting stuff that's come out around virtual events and how they, while they, create barriers for some people or magnify barriers, then they also make it sometimes a safer and more welcoming space. So I think that's really interesting. But when I was thinking about, online spaces that we're creating, I think there's a big elephant in the room that often we don't touch on, which is around the accessibility of like design and illustration and the physical kind of like virtual spaces that we're creating. Obviously this space has closed captions, which is amazing. I didn't even know Zoom could do that. But even, creating posters, creating websites, there's so many accessibility considerations we don't even think about. And I often don't think about, and I have people that pull me up on it. There's government kind of mandated guides on how you can create accessible online kind of spaces, and also like the visual illustrations as well, which I think not enough of us are thinking about, and, we all should be.
And we have a question about for graduating students going into the sector and the industries and looking for sort of tips about how to try and create more accessible spaces as they're starting out, and particularly if there's any questions that they could be asking, graduates could be asking as they go into the sector, asking institutions when they're entering, that might help navigate that. And any thoughts on that?
Was that to me or to the room?
Well, Rona, if you have any, or to the room.
No. I'm happy to speak on that. I think kind of going on, building on what Rona was saying before, I think for me, one of my other really big passions is access of events to people living in regional or isolated areas. And I think this COVID virtual events has really helped people in regional areas access events that they couldn't often before. So I guess for me, if you're starting out in the events industry and want to really make a space accessible for all people in terms of a regional sense, I think it's really important to make sure that your event isn't just centered around Metro Melbourne. I know that is like such a big thing, and I think that has been one of the benefits of COVID, is that people are able to access things that they weren't able to access before. So I think maybe once all of this dies down, just really considering possibly like opting for live streams in addition to your live events, or finding ways to engage regional people. I know travel isn't always an option, and I think that's a thing as well, is that people often assume people living in regional areas don't want to access things when they often do, and travel and time is such a barrier. So I think really making sure that that's a strong point there.
Thanks, Molly. And just around the room, any final hope-filled thought or recommended next step for graduates and other live participants who are listening in, tuning in? Dina, I wonder what your final thought is.
Just to add on as well, I think it's crucial, graduating students or not, to take that initiative to educate yourselves. Obviously, being a part of this webinar is that first step, but looking into workshops and other webinars to further educate yourself. And by you doing that, you can also spread that information with your colleagues and with your fellow students as well.
Thanks, Dina. Sally, your final thought, hope-filled thought?
I totally want to back up what Dina just said. I think there's so many great resources out there that, I think that the first thing, and something that everyone should be doing, is looking at those resources and getting advice from people that know more. And so that's the first point of, starting anything, so that you're coming at from a place of knowledge rather than making assumptions, because there's nothing worse than making assumptions and then being wrong about it.
Thanks, Sally. Rona, to you?
I think being creative and continuing to push yourselves to design new spaces every time rather than just duplicating. I think there's a lot of power in that. And it's also fun to, challenge yourself every time with creating a new way of approaching things.
Thank you. And Molly, any hope-filled thought from you as a sign-off?
Yeah, I think, we've seen a really great start in people becoming more aware of making events accessible, and just remaining critical and being open to ideas is key.
And Tiriro, hope-filled thought from you, or last next tip?
Yeah, I'd say in terms of creating spaces or curating events, choose some creatives or some people who you haven't worked with before, or organizations or collectives that align with your values and that are different. At least, I'd say at least choose one person, and that will make the team probably stronger, because they're kind of going to be plugging something new. And the other thing is, don't be afraid to make mistakes, because that's just learning, I think. Because sometimes, I know when I graduated from VCA, that was one of my kind of hesitations, was not making mistakes and always wanting to do things right. There's actually no right way. You kind of carve your own pathway. And so, just get the making mistakes out of the way early, so that you can just do and be.
Well, thank you all for carving your own way to being here to participate in the panel, and for generously sharing your perspectives and experiences. So thank you to our panel: Dina Bassel, Molly Jessup, Rona Glynn McDonald, Sally Mather, and Tiriro Mavondo. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the Victorian College of the Arts, including Dove, and the team for hosting this session. Thank you to The Push, including Artie, for curating our panel. And thank you to the caption team from AI Media for captioning for us today. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. Each panelist has shared some recommended resources to accompany this session, and you'll be receiving those resources following the session today. And from here, for those who have tuned in, I trust that you will find opportunities in your own practice to create events and spaces which are accessible, safe and welcoming for all. And my request is that when you do, please share your know-how with others so we can continue to learn how to reimagine the impossible to make things possible together. And that's it from us. We wish you all the very best.